don't fall, that's when you know you're gonna go dry. And it won't do no good to be crying out loud, babe, or cursing the sky. When the field turns round, you know famine coming all across.
Look at that. Good morning, or good afternoon. Actually, when people are watching this, it'll be evening. I'm in a little bit of a different setting right now in that I'll be doing the interviewing. I'll be interviewing Ronna, or I am interviewing Ronna Stuller. Good afternoon. Or
Hi.
Evening when everybody else sees it, but it's actually afternoon Saturday, barely afternoon. And we are talking about the council race this morning, or about your run for council, your candidacy for council. So thank you for being here. At your own
yes.
place, in your own show.
Yeah, across the table, it's
Yeah.
really a different experience for me. And if I inadvertently look at the clock or something, forgive me.
Or
It's
take
an old
over, tell me what to do, please go ahead.
But yes, it's really fun to be a guest sometimes.
We'll see if
So
we
thank you for-
remember which seat we're actually sitting in during this. So first I'm going to start just because, you know, my personal experience or knowledge of what we're talking about is from a different position in town. I'm used to serving on the Board of Education, and so just want to earnestly ask you, I can tell you what the exact roles are for a Board of Education member, but what are the exact responsibilities for a City Council member?
You know, I don't know all of it. There is a big time commitment. There are a lot of meetings, and as with Board of Ed, there are regular meetings twice a month, but also committee meetings that even if you're not on a committee, it's a good idea to attend all of those meetings. I see council as, well, I guess one of the reasons I'm running, because I kind of didn't expect to run this year. I was sort of ready to retire into some elder statesman, sit back in the lounge chair and dispense advice and not really get into the thick of it. But I had sort of a realization. I'm on the Planning and Zoning Commission right now. I like it a lot. I've done it for almost 5 years. And I got on that commission because I'm really interested in planning and how the city uses its spaces to make life better, hopefully, for its residents. And I realized a couple years ago when we were working on the Plan of Conservation and Development that the City Council, through its primary responsibility perhaps of setting spending priorities, is really doing a lot more planning than the Planning and Zoning Commission is, because, you know, in a city, as in a household, where you choose to spend your money is a reflection of what your values and your priorities and your needs are. And for me, that's the big role of council, is to figure out where city's money should go to provide the best return. And I guess now that we have an elected executive mayor, it's part of the whole checks and balances system. We have an elected executive mayor, and the city council is the legislative branch. So it's like Congress to our mayor's president.
Right. So do you want to expand a bit on the zoning piece, that you see council doing a lot more of that, and so therefore what is your view on the zoning? How should we be restructuring as a city?
Well, you know, 2 years ago, every 10 years actually, we have to do an update to our Plan of Conservation and Development. And we're supposed to be looking forward 10 years. And it was a frustrating process for me. I, along with Barry Levine, who's the chair of the Planning and Zoning Commission, were probably the two planning and zoning people who went to every meeting. And I found that it's really difficult to look at things, or for many people to look at things 10 years in advance. Like, for example, there's a piece on energy, and when we received the first draft, the procedure was that Peter Davis from RCDA would kind of provide a draft that was based on modification of what Norwich had done a couple years earlier. and he like sort of customize it to New London. So when we got the first draft, the only thing under energy was expand the natural gas network in New London. That was the only thing. And so I said, we're looking 10 years in advance. Of course, we want to make sure we don't have gas leaks. We have a well-maintained and efficient natural gas infrastructure in town. But 10 years down the road, we should be looking at how to move to renewable, cleaner energy. And I think after a couple of sessions, we ended up getting half a sentence in. It's like, while expanding our natural gas pipeline, we will also explore alternative renewable energy sources. And that was pretty much.
Right.
So that really got me thinking about how Planning and Zoning Commission was limited in really dealing with planning things. And City Council, so often they do allocations for roads, for buildings, for city services, for city staff. It really does, to me, reflect, if this year, the City and Town Development Act needs renewal. Every 5 years it needs to be renewed. And in the past, it's been a ballot referendum. A couple years ago, the state changed its rules, and it's a city council vote this year. And the City and Town Development Act has been controversial at times because it gives cities broader powers to do economic development than they would otherwise have. So in 2009, when it came to a vote, it almost didn't pass because Pfizer had just announced they were moving out of town. Once all their tax abatements were going away, they were pulling up stakes. The people who purchased Harbor Towers apartments condos could also get tax breaks thanks to the City and Town Development Act. And now, years later, without the tax breaks, there are problems within that building. I think it's pretty well known that many of the owners are in financial straits and can't sell their condos. So some of the characteristics of that act kind of give you money to develop now, but are really just kicking the can down the road. Eventually, the abatements will go away, and you don't really know until then whether what you did was a good idea.
So am I hearing somewhat, maybe in a simplified way, but am I hearing somewhat of, instead of that your methodology or your likes would be more that instead of reacting to what's at hand, having that vision for long-term planning and cognizance of what is and may be.
I think that is part of it, and I hadn't thought of it quite so succinctly. And I think part of it is I like to focus on like the little things that make life every day better for everyone, rather than, if a reputable developer comes in and they want to build a big apartment complex, I'm not going to tell them not to. Sure, I know AR Building that's now building the apartments in Parcel J. I've been at, they've come to planning and zoning workshops and meetings. They have good answers to questions. They're reputable to talk to. But I'm not sure my biggest interest lies in building, big apartment complexes as our economic development engine. I think if we make sure like fitness levels in our city are not what they should be. And one of the reasons is that people's sidewalks, lighting, neighborhoods are not necessarily safe for walking or biking. And there have been some improvements in this regard over this past administration. In particular, Bank Street being shrunk to 1 lane. That came to planning and zoning, and it was actually a close vote, but it passed. And so I do want to point to some good things that happened, without me. And the way that came about, I think, is an interesting methodology, because the first step was to just put paint on on the road to change the flow without actually investing in tearing anything up. In contrast to how, I don't know if you lived in New London when Captain's Walk was still in existence, but Upper State Street was a pedestrian mall when we moved here in the late 1970s. And they tore up State Street, and it cost millions of dollars, I'm sure. And then 20 years later, they spend millions of dollars to undo it. So I'm really glad to see that the city is doing some of these experimental things using paint to just try it out and hope that there's more of that kind of thing. So my focus is more on the small things. During op sale, when I would walk from my house to downtown, there were good sidewalks, but there were no shade trees, and in summer it was really a brutal walk. And the interaction between trees and sidewalks, and the fact that we really need both of them to be pedestrian-friendly cities is actually a challenge that I'm interested in and don't have a pat answer to, but wouldn't mind talking about.
So this is what I did this morning. It is a Saturday morning, and so I figured, oh my gosh, I've got to go interview Ronna. And I said, who do I have around me? And I had my family around me. So I asked a 14-year-old, a 10-year-old, and my husband, what would you ask a council candidate? So
this is great because since we're pre-taping, no one can phone in. So we sort of have your family are the phone-ins.
So my 14-year-old asked, how will you make change happen for real?
Change is really hard. People are often resistant to change, even when it's in their best interest, and when you don't know how things are going to turn out, it is difficult. I think in a way, I have to say you have been an example for me of someone who, while working, being on the Board of Education, to start with, I think you were the only non-Democrat on the board, and I remember some policies that you wanted to put forth, and you couldn't really do it through normal channels. And I had that same challenge the term I was on the Board of Education, and tried to shift consequences for the uniform policy in elementary school away from being punitive towards the students, towards outreach to the parents. Fortunately, state statute took care of that problem. You can't use recess as punishment anymore. But 10 years ago, it was on the books and Board of Education that a kindergartner who had 3 uniform offenses could be penalized by missing recess. And I couldn't get that passed. And it seemed like, I thought, I know I don't have the majority, but if I propose something that just makes so much sense and is humane but would be more effective than what we do now, of course people will support me. And they really didn't. So I do think sometimes it's important to do things indirectly, work. I do have a lot of experience working with a lot of nonprofits around town, as well as people who serve on different boards and commissions. And government sometimes does respond to the public. I think about the fracking waste ban that before the public brought it up, the city council was not aware of it. And there was an organized effort, and that was passed within 60 days.
So if you don't mind, I actually want to reframe a little bit, because I think saying indirectly can have a negative connotation of not doing something correctly through the right channels. And what I hear you saying is more of being more grassroots and using our community and other organizations in order to support the efforts that we want, rather than just going straight towards the policy, let's go for the vote type of a thing.
True, and when you put it that way, I think about FOI, and when Ella Grasso made it a campaign promise to pass FOI, the way the way she got it passed unanimously was to exclude political party caucuses from the public disclosure laws. And so what we've seen in New London frequently, and not just in New London, but in any town that has an almost monopoly party, whether it be Republican or Democrat. And honestly, I think the Green Party would be vulnerable to the same thing if we ever took over a city. That those party caucuses are behind closed doors. And then the people who have been at those caucuses come to the public meeting, and they're not really listening to the public, and they're not really listening to their colleagues on the boards who are from different parties, because the decision was made behind closed doors. But I think this is kind of the opposite, to bring the public to put pressure on the council or the Board of Ed to actually implement things that people, our community wants and needs.
Yeah, which is one of the reasons why people should be voting for you, and multiplicity of voice is because it creates a situation so that you don't have one, as you stated, one monopoly over the governance, so.
And this is kind of a long-standing issue with me. David Collins wrote a column 10 years ago, which was the year I was elected to Board of Education, cross-endorsed by the Republicans, which many Greens all over the country think is very bizarre. But one of the reasons behind it was to have more voices, more parties at the table, and less possibility of decisions being made behind closed doors, and forcing those decisions out into the open by not having that kind of monopoly.
Right. And back to the question about the 14-year-old's question about how to make change happen for real, I think you answered one of the ways prior by speaking to those small changes instead of the, what are the repercussions of, let's say, the reconfiguring of a street versus having some paint and saying, let's try this out, So I think that's another of those methods.
Yeah, and I think part of it, in taking Frida's lead as she runs for mayor, a big part of her campaign is like listening to people, like going to different neighborhoods and figure out what their needs are, how they're struggling, what would make things better. Because, as empathetic or sympathetic as I try to be, my experience is not really right now what struggling young families in New London are going through. I mean, I was in a struggling young family, but that was 35 years ago. So I think really making a commitment to listening what people's needs are and chipping away at them modestly, like not really looking for one, people all say, oh, this isn't a silver bullet, but yeah, like all of our housing is revolving around it. So much of the decisions about housing in New London now are being made on the basis of electric boat hiring a lot of people. And it works for now, and I'm willing to take it. I like having more people spending time in New London. But in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, is the federal government going to be authorizing 2 or more submarines a year? And if it stops being something the federal government can't afford or prioritizes, what do we do then? Are we just going to collapse because we put like all of our economic eggs in that one basket? Or can we figure out ways to diversify and have many small businesses in town that can make us more resilient?
I happened to be at the high school when there was a I think some history teachers hosted, I'm not sure, a multi-party candidate forum for their students, and I heard you. I don't know what it was in response to it, I can't remember, but you mentioned these steps on how to affect change, and it reminds me of this. Could you?
Yeah, in fact, it's on my literature instead of a quote.
Oh.
Well, it is kind of a quote. There's an organization called Strong Towns, which it was started by a fairly conservative Midwestern city planner who decided that like small incremental changes really can be more transformative than like searching for like a big bang kind of solution to problems. And this came from the Strong Towns website, and it's sort of their mission statement. And I thought that kind of fits how I look at things too. And it's how to prioritize public investment. Humbly observe where people are struggling and ask, what is the next small thing we can do to address the struggle, and do it. Do it now, and then repeat the process. So, figuring out. And on the good side, I think what the changes that were made to Bank Street downtown were one thing that has happened over the past few years that kind of reflect that attitude, I think. I think a lot of people lost rear view mirrors or got dings in their car or risked injury the way Bank Street was with the two very narrow lanes. And that change was really small, and even after it was finished, didn't involve a whole lot more than paint on the street, a little bit of upgrading of crosswalks. And yet, like just thousands of people drive on that street now with less stress, with something that probably, I don't know how much it costs, but probably not a huge line item.
There's two things that I love in that, just the small, as you pointed out, but I also really love the word humbly, the humility there, because of course we want our elected leaders to have some ideas and strength and conviction of what their vision is, but they're also there. I mean, I think it's vital to have the humility, because each of our experiences, I mean, this is representation. Each of our experiences aren't those necessarily of those being represented. So that humility of what is it that you need is massively important. So I appreciate that.
And I have to say, I think the Green Party in New London, at least, has come from that place for a long time. It seems to me there was an op-ed written maybe 15 years ago that mentioned, or a platform item that mentioned something like, New Londoners could use more humility and more hopefulness. And the humility for the reasons you stated, but also the hopefulness that we've been through a lot, and like we were capable of doing things right.
Yeah. Well, I think it also creates hope to know that your voice is included in that change, because that's what I want, is a future that works for me. So, so going on to one of my husband's questions for you, because this is my family's interview of you.
Thanks, Martina's good family.
His question was, how can we make green programs, so recycling, composting, planting trees, basically environmental stewardship, economically viable for the community? Or how can we translate green ideas into a green economy?
Well, I guess the first thing I want to address is the term economically viable. Anything can be considered not economically worth investing in if the results of that are important to you. We don't ask very often, is our fire department, economically viable? We want that service. And I was looking at the budget, and we'll talk more about money later, I imagine, but I was looking at the goals set for the different departments, And for Public Works, a lot of the goals were things like, I even highlighted it. I just couldn't. I just thought it was so striking. It was streamlined, find cost-effective ways to do it, save money, become more efficient for Public Works. And these are people who plow our streets, pick up our trash, deal with solid waste and recycling on many levels. And what they do is kind of invisible a lot of the time, but really important and impacts like all of us every day.
I'm sorry, but I think in order for that, so in contrast to what were the goals in the other departments?
And the police, let me see if I can find. Okay, so for the firefighting division, obtain equipment and provide training, establish policies and procedures, to replace an engine. A lot of it was replacing frontline trucks, improvements to communications, conducting promotional exams, conduct entry-level exams, apply for grants to increase staffing. So that was the fire department. And see if I have the police department. It was also the uniformed services. Continue quality of life patrols, participate in shoreline traffic accident reconstruction team, formation of regional emergency response, and some of it is good civil rights stuff, use less lethal firearms, increase the crisis intervention team, develop the school resource officer program, do better crime analysis. And
so for some of the departments, their goals are actually how to make the department
function better.
Yes, function better. But as opposed to for some, it's about how to lessen it.
Yes, and
do you happen to know if those goals are written by the department heads or if they're written by the
I do not
proposal, or in other words, I guess the mayor, the proposal of the budget?
I really don't. But I have the Public Works goals. Public Works has 10 divisions, and these are just the goals. The summary is, includes, improving safety and professionalism, but at the same time, improve operational efficiency, identify opportunities for cost savings, maximize effectiveness. It ripples through all of these different departments. Improve operational efficiency. They do want to increase recycling, reduce the waste stream, reduce injuries, but also continue to identify cost savings through modified maintenance practices.
Right.
Identify and sell surplus fleet, and that's in direct contrast to the firefighters, which talks about replacing vehicles. In Public Works, they're talking about reducing the fleet inventory. So I think that, I think that Public Works, because what it does doesn't make front page of the newspapers. If the fire department responds to a fire, and I respect firefighters a lot. I'm glad we have a professional unionized fire department. I don't think going to a volunteer department would be a good idea, but I think we really need to study whether the levels of staffing and the level of equipment are appropriate to the here and now. Building codes have gotten much better. There are fewer fires, I'm sure, than there were a couple decades ago because of improved safety. People have smoke detectors. Big buildings have sprinkler systems. There's so much more proactive stuff going on when it comes to urban fires that we should be getting maybe some kind of bonus on the reaction side because we've been successful on the proactive side. And I don't know what the outcomes of studying this would be, but I think we need to take a serious look at it and not just say whatever the fire department wants, we should just automatically rubber stamp it because needs and times change.
Yeah. Yeah. We're going to move on to the 10-year-old.
Okay.
I think just to give context that this comes from, I live on a one-block historic street, and we have, I believe it's just two, old, mature oaks on the street that are slated to come down, and it's really gonna. I think he's heard us talking about how it's gonna change the feel of the street in multiple ways, and so his question was, I'm just saying, I think that's where this comes from. And so his question was, lots of trees are being cut down because the roots are destroying the sidewalks. But how can, this is his question, but how can we work with the trees so that they could still be there? So I'm wondering what you'd have to say to him.
That is really a challenge. I mentioned that, when I walked back and forth from Upsale, the sidewalks were good, but there was no shade. To be truly pedestrian friendly in summer in New England, you really need to have both shade and good, safe sidewalks. And there have been places in New London, not your street, unfortunately, where there's been enough width in the street that the street could get reduced and real adequate tree planting strips could be put in. Granite Street was done in two sections that way, and between Hempstead and, I don't know, the street that runs next to the Dunkin' Donuts on Bank Street that
Granite was
on Granite, on Granite Street between Hempstead and Channing Street.
Okay.
They actually narrowed the street,
Right.
and they have big shade trees in like an 8-foot buffer.
Yeah.
That wouldn't work on a narrow
Right.
street like yours. I do wonder if people would, if it's practical to make bump outs for the streets, like reduce a couple of parking spaces. Your street is a one-way street anyway, and if you use the width of the car for the, already narrowing the street to a certain point, whether there are a couple locations where big tree circles could be put that jut out from the sidewalk into the parking area. I don't know if that would work on your street because parking is also a challenge.
Yeah.
There are some narrow streets in New London that are difficult. What was done, though, in the Eugene O'Neill parking lot is those trees were planted not in soil, but in a special soilless mix so that they, in theory at least, will not heave the concrete around them. It's an expensive way to plant trees, but I think that in some of our city locations, we might want to experiment with that. It's like a cage. Their roots are in a cage filled with a soilless mix. And
are they, my concern would be, I don't know anything about this, but that because they're constricted to a certain shape versus being able to reach out and grab, their surroundings, that they wouldn't be, that really large trees would not be super stable.
I don't know. It was recommended by like Kenton Frost, the landscape architects that designed it. And so I would, if the city were thinking about doing that on a broader scale, I probably would ask, Brian Kent or Chad Frost to give a presentation on how it works. But I know they did plant large trees there, elm trees and red maples, big shade trees.
On Granite?
No, not on Granite. Well, they did on Granite as well.
Large
They
trees?
had enough dirt. There are sugar maples, I think, on Granite Street as well. But also in that municipal parking lot, those are big trees. They're not big yet, but they're meant to be very large shade trees. I think there are some blight-resistant elms at where the intersections come. There are red maples. So they're meant to be large shade trees, and they are planted in such a way, not in soil, that's supposed to preserve the the built sidewalk around them.
Okay.
I'd want to research that.
So I mean, I find this to be a very important issue because, I agree with him just because I do think it makes a difference of the character, meaning our walkability, our comfort in our communities, the temperatures of our neighborhoods. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a bigger conversation of just, he was stating the sidewalks, but it's, a lot more than that. I also want to move on to some other subjects.
Just very briefly, I wanted to mention that part of it is that some places can't take large shade trees, but can take some kinds of trees. I've been participating for the last few years in some tree planting efforts in South Philadelphia that has streets every bit as narrow as yours. And they are planting street trees, and they're not planting huge trees, but there are ways that you can get some trees in even if you don't have a lot of space.
Yeah, I definitely would like to see some kind of a system for the city, and I don't know whether it exists, but I'd like to see some kind of a system that of replacing, Yeah. But education, back to this one's mine. Yeah. Just wanting to know if you have views on, this is pretty broad, on our relationships, on priorities from the municipal side, on your beliefs on all of that. The education system, as you know, is massively important. I don't even want to say, to me, it's a huge portion of our population and impact on our community, on real estate values. There's just moral responsibility. So many reasons. So what are your ideas around all that?
I think education is supremely important. I'm not, I've been disconnected from the Board of Ed for quite a long time. So the details of, the magnet system was formed after I left the board. I have to say I really wonder, and I'm troubled by kind of a hostile attitude of many New Londoners against our Board of Education and our New London public school system, without claiming that there's no room for improvement, because there's always room for improvement. I've heard in 2 forums during this election cycle, one, that the school budget is 65% of the city budget, which is not true. And 2, that the school budget has gone up 3% a year for the last decade, which is also not true. And they're not just not true a little bit, they're not true a lot. Even if you don't count in the share of the school budget that comes through education cost sharing and other grants and other state monies, even if you look at that, the number and do the math, it's like 47% of the budget. And the taxpayers don't only foot maybe about half of that amount.
Right.
So, I mean, we could, if anyone really wants to get in touch with us for like the exact numbers, I'd be happy to bring them out. But the schools are not the reason the taxes are high here.
Right.
And if you look at return on investment and not just the raw dollars, once again, like public works, you have thousands and thousands of people, the students and their families impacted every single day by what happens in the schools. This is supremely important. And so it mystifies me that there's such a negative feel about it, and that untruths about its impact on taxpayers just seem like they seem rife, and I don't know why. It's disturbing, and I don't know. I don't know what it is. I worry, and I'm like an old white lady, but I worry that in our city, the demographic makeup of the older population in our city is quite different from our younger citizens and children. So, in my age range, probably the city's maybe 60% white. I'm throwing that out. I'm not sure, but I'm sure it's a majority. Yet in our schools, it's a very different picture. And I don't remember exactly what the proportion is, but part of the goal of the magnet system is for our schools to be 25% white. So the city share is less than that. So I do wonder if there's some sort of unconscious racism, something that, the older taxpayers don't relate to the students in the school well. I don't know, and I don't really have an answer or a solution to it, but I think it's worth all of us reflecting on why we take, like the fire department, at its word. We need this, sure, have it, and yet Public Works and the Education Department are given a much harder time and kind of almost assumed to be trying to game the system. I don't know what's causing it. It's a dynamic that I think our city needs to look at in order to really be a whole city. I don't know if that answered the question at all. I don't even remember quite what Jesse's question was.
That one was not Jesse's, that one was mine.
Oh, that was
It was just in general wanting to hear about you couldn't guess that the education one was right?
Yeah, I guess I should have known, of course.
No, it was just in general wanting to know about your values, beliefs, attitudes, suggestions. So it was very broad about just, being that it is a large portion of the municipal budget, just wanting to hear, any suggestions or comments on that.
And the other thing I want to say is I'm a retired preschool teacher in education, and I have two, very grown-up kids now who were public school students. And so I kind of follow education, but I have to say, right now, running for city council, I'm not that knowledgeable about the details of the running of New London public schools. So I imagine that most people who are also serving on city council don't know more than I do. Some might know a little more, some might know a little or a lot less.
And I think as a former Board of Ed member, you actually do have a decent grasp.
Generally, but as I said, since the system in New London has changed a lot since I was on the board. So I think that we have to have a certain level of trust of the people whose lives are impacted by the schools and are really immersed in the details of running the system and not assume that we know more. I do think that the people who are immersed and who are running the system need to be open to answering questions about it. And we should be asking questions about it. But I don't think we who don't know as much should be making assumptions without first asking the questions and listening to the answers. And I guess that's a piece where I think the humility piece does come in.
That's what I was thinking.
That, it's important to know what you know, but it's important to know what you don't know as well, and to know how to ask the people who do have that expertise.
Right. So is there something else about the budget that you've seen? You were talking a little bit about the priorities that you saw. What else have you noticed in the budget in your reviews?
What else did I notice? Well, not that much. I mean, I mentioned that I thought the departmental goals were really interesting. I guess I had mentioned that at one of the forums, it was claimed that the board budget went up 3% a year, and right now, when I looked at the numbers from 2017 actual numbers, and then through the current budget that we're in the middle of, the budget appears to be less than flat funded, because if you looked at the numbers between 2017 and 2020 budgets, the amount of increase was less than $500,000. And at the same time, custodial services, were switched from a city line item to a board line item, and that's a little over $500,000. So the increase that the schools have enjoyed over 5 years was totally eaten up by the custodial service move. So it just, we have more students than we did before. It's really odd to me that the schools are seen to be spendthrifty. And the other thing that came up in a different conversation with you was things like health insurance premiums. And I just want to bring up, because I have been working with a group that's trying to get Medicare for all, understanding that at a federal level, a universal health care system will be slow. There are bills in both houses of Congress, but it will be slow. But I wanted to note that New York State and Massachusetts State both have statewide bills, and the New York one might pass this year, to provide universal health care within the state of New York. And I think we have to really pressure our legislators to work on this, because providing health insurance to municipal employees is a really expensive proposition, and it goes up every year.
Right. I'm kind of actually sad that you brought this topic up, because it does really fire me up, and I've got some of my own comments to make on it, and I don't want to get lost down that rabbit hole because we have the limited time left. But that is massive. There's so much there.
There is so much
and
there.
I can go on in certain rants and cost numbers and.
Yeah, and this is an expenditure that the city doesn't really get much value from. And I think just generally budget-wise, we need to be looking at, as we spend these dollars, what value are we actually getting from each item?
I mean, maybe we should go on and pivot a little bit and talk about forums coming up. Do you want to tell us where people could get some other information?
Sure.
About you
For
and
the
other
city
candidates?
council forums, on Wednesday, October 23rd, will be the Day Paper and League of Women Voters forum, and it will be at the Science and Technology Magnet High School, and it'll be an interesting format. There are 12 candidates, so they'll have 3 of us as in 4 teams sitting at tables. And we found out who our team members are. I will be with Adam Spricacci and John Sadai.
Interesting.
I don't know how. I know they've tried to split up parties, but I don't know.
Yeah.
So, and then that same Friday, the 25th, will be the Neighborhood Alliance Forum at the Senior Center. There will be one more mayoral forum that will be on Tuesday.
Wait, so Wednesday and Friday are council?
Both council.
Okay.
And then, I am trying to remember this, Tuesday, the 29th, I think it's Tuesday the 29th, will be the mayoral forum that's Neighborhood Alliance. We have a slide for this.
Okay, all right, great.
Yeah, and I don't remember when the new Board of Ed forum will be.
They're all in my calendar, but we
Yeah.
have a slide for
Yeah,
you.
if people, and we have a slide to give them all. I did write down, so I remembered the city council ones.
Okay, all right. And I think we should look at the ballot.
Yeah, I think so
But-
too.
Here, let's take a, you want to show
Sure.
us?
Can we
Okay.
zoom in a little more? So, one thing I've been kind of trying to do for years is to get a better ballot in Connecticut. And only New York State and Connecticut have these rows. Most of them have all the candidates in a list. But the 2 things to point out, the green line is line D, and I am in it on 2D. And then if you move over this way, you see Charmaine Greger. Charms is our Board of Ed candidate on the green line. And then if you look at the ballot you'll get At the polls, it will be empty in the 1E position. Frida Berrigan was endorsed by the Green Party to be our mayoral candidate. The Secretary of State disagreed. We're right, but they've got the law on their side. So we are encouraging people to look at videos. If you didn't go to the mayoral forums in person, we can certainly send the link to both of them if you missed them.
But what you want to do to support Frida
can you put that?
Yeah, what you want to do to support Frida is, here, I'm going to keep it there, is to fill in, to write her name in 1E, write Frida, Frida, and it actually doesn't matter if you misspell it, and then fill in that little bubble saying that is your choice. Just to give you an option with all this.
Is really important because if you don't, the ballot won't go into that side pocket that allows it to be hand counted. Because what will happen is any write-ins go into a different part of the tabulator, and then after the tabulators are voted, they go through them and they hand count how many Fridas are on there.
Okay, all right.
And so, we really recommend people listen to Frida, vote for Frida, and know how to do it, because it's a little bit even trickier than it would be finding her spot on 1D.
Okay, all right. So we have just a couple of minutes, and I'm glad we got those out of the way. So is there anything else that you want to share about yourself as a candidate?
I just wanted to talk a little bit about the Green Party. I think we're different. We're based on values, not on putting together a kind of machine of people who have similar but not always the same values in order to get people elected. So a short anecdote, after the Board of Ed debate that was hosted by the Neighborhood Alliance last week, one of the Democratic candidates for Board of Education came up to me and said, "Will Frida get in trouble if she puts my sign on her lawn?" And I said, of course not.
Right.
We look for multiple candidates being successful, the best from whatever party, and we support them all. But it did give me kind of a jolt knowing that some parties do force their candidates only to support people on their same line. The Greens don't do that. We don't take lobbyist money at all, even though the law allows us to in a limited way. We don't take corporate money. We just take money from real people, and that's so we are accountable to real people. So I think that's my last bit. Just, it's hard to find our names or our spaces to write our names on the ballot, but I hope you all do so.
Thank you, Ronna.
Thank you, Myrna.
Bye. Have a good night.
Yeah, and next time it will be an interview with Frida, also pre-taped. But we'll see you then next week.